Hello and welcome to World Talks. I'm Diana Skaya. EU leaders gathered for an emergency summit in Brussels where they debated a new defense plan at one of the most critical moments for European security since World War II. Now they backed plans to spend more on defense and pledged to continue to stand by Ukraine in a world upended by Donald Trump's reversal of U.S. policies. Joining me now in studio to discuss is Kerry Longhurst, professor at Collegium Civitas. Professor, so happy to have you here on World Talks with us this morning.
Really happy to be here.
A lot has happened. What conclusions can we make of this summit? I mean, what were the key takeaways?
Well, the language that people are using is, high stakes and a watershed, basically. And what, amongst a lot of talk, a lot of discussions, a lot of press conferences, what really came out of the summit of the meeting is that Europe is now committed to rearming. Rearming Europe, rearming the European Union member states and obviously the UK as well. And coupled with that, there's a pledge from the side of the EU to ramp up its military support, its military aid for Ukraine. So it's a big step forwards, and hopefully the rhetoric is going to be matched with actually concrete commitments and real spending.
How do you think that Europe is going to be able to fill in this gap and provide the necessary support on its own? With the fact that the U.S. suspended its military or froze its military.
Yeah, in terms of the financing, it seems to be quite straightforward. If nothing else, the EU is quite good at finding money, repackaging money for new projects. So that's not a problem at all. So as far as I understand, there's going to be a huge amount of new loans, new money in a way available. And then the EU is going to redraft or recreate the money that normally goes into the Stability and Growth Pact, which will enable the member states to, in a way, kind of claw back money to spend on their own defence budgets. So I think there's an ecosystem for funding already established. So that's nothing to worry about, I would say.
Let me ask you this. Slovakia has been pushing for the resumption of, Russian gas transit through Ukraine, was expected to veto EU aid to Kiev if demands were not met. Then we have Hungary refusing to endorse a joint EU statement in support of arming Ukraine. What should we know about this? What's important here?
Yeah, well, two relatively small states in amongst a larger group, all of which have committed to this. And we shouldn't forget that apart from Hungary, all member states signed up to the actual declaration that came out of the summit. So it's only really Hungary which is the kind of troublemaker in amongst all of this. But that's not a surprise, and that's not going to stop the EU as a whole moving forwards. When it comes to Slovakia, okay, that's a slightly more reasonable issue that's had there, and that's about energy, as you described. And this has been factored into the final paragraph or the conclusions of the summit. So that's been kind of overcome or smoothed over to some degree. Moreover, Slovakia has signed up to the declaration. So, yeah, unsurprisingly, it's Hungary that's the troublemaker here, but the EU can overcome that. That's not a major hurdle.
You're saying that Hungary is a troublemaker here. How do you see this, evolving?
I'd say devolving. I'd say that it's a negative trend, and it's something that we've known for the best part of a decade. There are no surprises here. Orban is very clearly in the pocket of President Putin, whether it's to do with energy, political relations. He's signed up to that. He's signed up to that, Kremlin-led discourse. So, and it's odd that, in a way, Hungary is still solidly within the European Union. It's predictable, we know it. We've just got to kind of overlook it to a certain degree right now and move ahead. But I think it's a misplaced loyalty on his part.
Let's shift gears here for a moment. French president suggested extending France's nuclear deterrence to other EU nations. How likely is this going to gain traction? And do you see any challenges that could come out of such a decision?
I'm sure challenges are ahead, but I don't think Macron would announce this unless there's been some serious discussion in Paris about this possibility. This is massive. This is huge, potentially, and I think it's really welcomed. I think it's sensible. I think it's in keeping with Europe's desire to rearm. And as you know, it's only the UK and France who are nuclear powers in Europe. And maybe in the coming days, we might hear something similar from Keir Starmer to extend the UK deterrent as well. I mean, of course, the size of the French and or the British nuclear deterrent is really quite small compared to Russia's, but nevertheless, having that nuclear umbrella is very important. And as this war in Ukraine is not ceasing, and indeed might be, taken forwards in the coming weeks and months, that nuclear deterrent umbrella could be really very, very important and warmly received.
An open door.
Absolutely.
Professor, we've been talking so much now here about this EU unity, and now the idea of a coalition of a willing to support Ukraine, it has gained momentum. What role would you say this coalition could play? And particularly what I want to ask you is this: how might Russia respond, even though it may possibly be even difficult to predict, but in your opinion?
I mean, I think in terms of the Russian response, I'm pretty sure that the Kremlin is not quaking in its boots. I think, like for many people, other external actors, the Europeans, the EU, however you want to frame it, is not seen as a credible actor in security and defence terms. So it's really up to us, it's up to the Europeans, European leaders, to fulfil those pledges about rearmament, increasing defence spending, and then we might see how Putin reacts to that. At the moment, I'm pretty sure he's discounting that as it being anything serious at all.
Let's stay on Russia now. I mean, Russia has repeatedly warned, of course, against European peacekeeping, having any sort of peacekeeping mission installed in Ukraine. How do you think, though, increased EU military involvement could actually impact the broader geopolitical landscape?
Well, according to the discussion in Brussels, according to the size of the budget or the money available, it could be seismic. It could really alter the balance, especially as the US pulls out in every single way. It seems that the plan is for Europe to kind of more than fill that gap. Mm-hmm. And don't forget that, it's not just about Europe rearming and playing that more traditional defence or security role. The summit also outlined, for example, how there's a renewed commitment for bringing Ukraine into the European Union. And that's a very, very slow process in its social and its economic and political. But this, again, is going to contribute to a rebalancing of that geopolitical landscape. It's going to widen the European Union's, I hate that phrase, but sphere of influence and its importance across the whole of Europe. So this is where the real rebalancing is going to occur, slowly but surely.
Donald Trump, if we stay on that note, said that he is not going to defend any EU country if they are delinquent with their NATO defense spending commitments. And he's also said that despite a rise in how much they've spent, that the current defense expenditures of other NATO member states simply are not enough. Well, what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, I don't like to agree with him, but it's true that we haven't been spending enough and we need to spend more. But on the main point, really, he says a lot of things and then he forgets what he says, or he purposely forgets what he says. So I think we have to take a step back and not respond to everything, every issue, every argument that's brought up, depending on the mood of the day or depending on who he's talking to. Whether the US is going to fully retract from Europe, well, we'll see. It's hard to imagine, but it's hard to imagine many of the things that have been occurring over the last, 5 or 6 weeks or so. But, the Europeans are fulfilling what he asked them to do. They are ramping up defence spending. They are building, suggesting they're going to build more combined facilities and defence equipment. So we're kind of fulfilling what was asked of us. Right. But we'll see what the ultimate response is when we come up with the goods.
Professor, do you think that the actions that, with the Trump administration is taking that could be detrimental to the global order?
Yeah, absolutely. I think they already are. I think just the rhetoric that started 5 or 6 weeks ago have already dislodged a lot of the assumptions that we had about peace and security. So I think we're already on a kind of slippery slope to a different kind of world order with different poles of power. And what's interesting, I think, for us sitting here in Warsaw is really about how Europe is going to figure in that. And I think with the rearmament plan, with the offer of considerable military aid, it seems that Europe is realising that we can be a core pillar in this new emerging world order, and that we shouldn't assume that we're going to be in partnership with the United States.
All right, you said a very key word here, assume. I'd like to ask you a final question. I mean, we are hearing or reading reports, of course, broken out by your Fox News, claiming that there would be a meeting between Ukrainian president, that he's going to travel to Saudi Arabia to have a sit-down with his American counterparts. I mean, can we assume what this meeting might entail? Would it involve some kind of possible conclusions? What can we... although we're too soon to tell.
Yeah, I mean, I think today we're going to see a rolling out some, details of delivery as to what's going to be on the agenda, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, Fox News is what the dual face of the Donald Trump Foundation, so I'm weary about laundering the information that comes out from Fox News media outlets. But nevertheless, I think what we can expect, or definitely assume, or we know already from the discussions in Saudi Arabia, is that none of the red lines, none of the expectations from the side of the US are going to change. Since the disastrous, awful meeting last week in Washington with Zelensky, the tone, the nature, the vocabulary coming out of the American administration hasn't changed. So we know that they assume they want the same kind of deal that they spoke about last week. So that's for certain. I think as well, as commentators, we have to be careful about calling it peace talks or calling it a peace settlement, because it's not. Ukraine, as far as we know right now, is not going to be a full stakeholder in any meeting. The Ukrainians, the Europeans do not want to have a discussion only between the US and Russia. That's not a peace settlement. But
so what might Zelensky expect, just very briefly, what might Zelensky expect, because we're in under 30 seconds from this meeting going?
Well, I think he has to be bold. I think he needs to have Europe behind him. He's got to go into the meeting knowing full well that EU allies are behind him and supporting him, and that he's not going to give up on it.
Thank you so much, Kerry Longhurst, Professor at Collegium Civitas, for all your input here this morning. And that completes this edition of World Talks. I'm Diana Skaya. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more news